Alright, so in this video we're going to go over day one of Unity. We're going to get our projects to the point where we have all our art assets in and our player moving and jumping. So to get started, I'm in Unity. If you're on the school computers, you'll want to search for the Unity app and open Unity itself instead of the Unity Hub. From here we're going to create a new project. And yours may look a little different from mine, but we're going to look for the 2D template, 2D core. I'll just leave this as default, and then I'm going to let my project save to the desktop. If you're working on one of the computers in the classroom, go ahead and create your project on the desktop. Otherwise, create it wherever is convenient for you, and then you can move it to a drive after the fact and bring it to class. So I'm going to go ahead and create my project, and it's going to do its thing, and it's going to load up. On your first launch, may take a second, but when it's ready, it'll be ready. So we're just going to pause for a second and we'll come back when it's ready. Alright, so my Unity project is loaded. You may encounter this window here about a new version. We're just going to close that. We'll ignore it. But now, here we are with Unity. So, quickly looking at the different windows, we got our hierarchy. This is like your outliner in Unreal, where all of your scene assets are organized. We got our scene window, where we build everything. Then we got up here, you'll see our game window. This will display our game. And right away, I'm going to go ahead and grab that and dock it next to the scene window so that we can view both at the same time. Over here we have our inspector window, where all we add components and change settings and all that. Then down here we have our project window, where we're going to organize all our assets, as well as our console, which will help us for troubleshooting our code later on. So to get started, I'm over here, I'm selected on my assets. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this assets. And we're going to start by importing our textures. So I have mine created. You may have seen on the examples that we have, these are just a compilation of all our different sprites. So I have over here some assets, and then you can just click and drag and drop them directly into the project, and they'll be brought in right here. So if we look down here, we see our different sprite sheets. This one's got my environmental assets as well as a rock. First thing we'll want to do is go over to the inspector on the right side here, and we're going to look at the max size and the default settings here, and we want to go ahead and set that to match the texture size. So when I created this document, it was 4096 by 4096, so I'm going to go ahead and up it here, press apply. That way our texture matches what we created it at. This is a way for us to like compress the texture if we need to. And I'll go ahead and do that on my character sheet here as well. So first thing we need to do is we need to separate these textures into different sprites. So right now it would treat this as one sprite, but we want to make it, each individual one. So to do that, we're going to select on one of our assets, go up into the inspector, change the sprite mode from single to multiple. Then we'll go down to the sprite editor, press apply if you have any unapplied settings. Oh, where'd it go? Come back. We don't need to dock it. And up in the top left of the sprite editor, we're going to see slice, automatic. And if we press slice, what this will do is it's going to chop up our texture sheet into individual sprites based on how it's laid out. So when creating this in the first place, you definitely want to give it some room in between each asset to have, so it knows where to put them. If you find yourself with a box, like say this one was too big, on any of them you select them, and then you have these manipulators where you can go and change their size. And then likewise, if something's not quite right, you can just click on one and delete it if you don't want one there. Or say this piece was supposed to have both of these involved, but it made one for each. like say I want these on the same sprite sheet, I can just go ahead and delete one of them and then resize the other one to encompass both of them. But I'll just leave it as how it worked by default because I like the results. So once you like the results, hit apply, and it's going to go ahead and create your sprites. So if we go back to our main one here, there's a little arrow next to it. If we open that, you'll see it turned each sprite into its own asset. So I'm going to go ahead and do that one more time for my character layer as well. I'm just going to do an automatic slice. I like the results, and then I'll go ahead and apply. Okay, so at this point we got our assets sliced up and ready to use. So let's start bringing them into the scene. So I'm going to go ahead and drag them in. I got my foreground, I got my midground, and I got my background. And then right away I'm actually going to go up in the game window and set free aspect up here to 16:9. That way it'll lock the camera to a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is, that's closer to what I'll have my final look being. So right away, you'll see that, these aren't displaying on the right layers, or I want my background in the back and my foreground in the front. So what we do is if we look over in the inspector, we'll see these in the additional settings, we'll see an option called sorting layers. Now this lets us organize our assets kind of like Photoshop layers. So to do this, we need to first create a couple sorting layers to assign things to. But what I'm going to do first is actually rename my assets in the hierarchy here. So I'll just call this background. I'll just do shortcuts for now. BG for background. This is my midground. And then this one I'm going to call my playable area. So you can call these whatever you want. Just label them now because you'll want to keep this organized. So once these are labeled, we're going to select one of them, any one of them, and we'll go to sorting layer. If we click it, we'll see add sorting layer. Then we're going to add 3 sorting layers, and we're going to name them background, midground, and then playable area. If you have foreground elements as well that are in front of where the player is, then you could add an additional foreground layer. So how it organizes them is whatever layers on the bottom will display in front. So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd think, but bottom layer displays in front. So once you got your sorting layers created, go ahead and select one of your objects. You can select them in the hierarchy or select them right in the scene. And then we're going to assign them to a sorting layer. So if I assign the background layer to the background, and then I assign the midground to the midground, you'll see that it's jumping up in place, and then the playable area to the playable area, you'll now see we got them displaying correctly. And then looking at the game window as kind of reference to how it'll look, I want these a little smaller, so I'm going to go ahead, select all 3 of them, and I'm going to scale them down. And you can use, like in most other 3D programs, you have W, E, and R to switch between move, scale, and rotate. So I'm going to scale these down a bit to get them so I can see them a little more. Now, next thing we'll do is we'll go back to our assets. And I'm just going to go into my character sheet. I'm just going to grab a idle kind of neutral pose, and I'm going to drag that into my scene because we'll need it for reference, and we'll obviously need it in general. So first thing I'll do is I'm going to select it in my hierarchy, and I'm going to rename it to player character. Oh, caps lock was on. Player character. And then I'll go ahead and select it, and you'll see I'm behind everything right now. So we're going to go ahead and put it on a sorting layer. And I'm going to put this on my playable area sorting layer. That way we're on this same layer as our ground here. So what you'll notice now is they're on the same layer, but I want my little guy here to be in front of this ground. So to make that happen, we utilize the order in layer right below the sorting layer. So while I'm selected on my player character, if I go to the order in layer and change this value to 1, you'll see it'll be above my ground now. So this is great because now we can have multiple objects on this layer. And then the higher the number order in layer on the order in layer, the highest number it displays on top. So it's another way of organizing them. So my guy's really big, so I'm going to go ahead and go to scale mode and just scale him down until he's at a size I like. I'll just kind of position him down here. Alright, so I got my player in and I got my ground in. So next thing we want to do after our objects are in and after they're assigned to sorting layers, next thing we got to do is start adding some interaction and physics. So to get started with that, we need to select any of our layers. So, or not any of our layers. We'll actually start with the player character. So on our player character, we'll come over to the inspector and we'll see an option down here. It's called Add Components. And if we press Add Component, we can now add some different modifiers. So first off, I'm going to go to Physics 2D, scroll down a little bit, and look for Rigid Body 2D. We're going to click that on. So what this will now say is that for this object, simulate physics on it. So if we were to press play right now, we'll see our guy will just fall down. So we don't want that. We want him to collide with something. So in order for collision to work, we need to add a collider to the player as well as the ground. So for the player, I'm going to select him and add a new component. And we're going to add a component called a capsule collider. So once your collider's in, you'll see it will appear on your character here. And we'll just come over to our settings and we want to click and drag on the X and Y, and we kind of want to resize our collider to kind of match our character a little bit. Think of this, this is their hitbox. So something like that should be good. So now we got a rigid body and we got a collider. So now if we press play right now, we'll have the same effect. They'll just fall through the earth because there's nothing for them to land on. So what do? We got to add something to our playable area. So I'm selected on my ground here. We're going to add a component to our ground, and we're going to add a, Physics 2D, we're going to add an edge collider. So edge colliders are cool because if we go ahead and take a look here, we see that it put this line across our entire piece. And if we turn on the editor right here, we can click and drag different points into our sprite here to create the shape. So we click and drag points to kind of match the contour of our ground here. So once our edge collider's in and our player has a collider and a rigid body on it, now we can press play and they should interact with each other. So they land and fall over. So if we don't want them to fall over, it's an easy switch or an easy fix. Make sure we're out of play mode. And we're going to come over to the rigid body 2D on our player character. We're going to come down to constraints, and then we're going to freeze the rotation in the Z. So freeze the rotation. Now when we press play, it'll just fall down and won't move. We can lift it up, let it fall. There you go. So we'll get out of play mode and we'll go on to our next step. So already it's coming along. We got our different layers. On the sorting layers, we got a ground with a collider on it, and we got a player with a collider and a rigid body. So next step is we're going to want to get get some more interaction going and get some code hooked up. So first thing I'm going to do here now is create a new folder in my assets. I'm going to call this scripts, and I'm going to go ahead and import my scripts. So if you go into our shared folder in the demos folder and then into the Unity folder, there should be a scripts folder, and then in there you'll find 3 different scripts which you can drag and drop directly into your scripts folder. They should go ahead and take a second, and then they'll import. We got 3 here. We got follow camera, player controller, and project move. So what do we do with these? So to get started with them, we need to apply them to one of our objects here. So in this case, I want to take our player controller script and attach it to our player. So to do that, you select your player, so they're open over here, and then you can drag and drop the player controller right onto it, or you could go to add components, scripts, and then you'll see a list of your scripts here, and then you just select the one you want. So when we add a script, you'll see a variety of settings here. We got our move speed, our jump speed, a ground check, what is ground and grounded. So next thing we need to do is we need to set up one other thing. We got to set up this ground check here. So what the ground check is doing is how the code is set up is actually, let's take a look at it. If you double click your code, it'll go ahead and open up Visual Studio, which is where we'll edit the code. So let's have a peek here. So what's going on here? So if we look at our code here, up at the top, we have all the different variables that are being set. So we have, like, you see our move speed, our jump height, our ground check, or what is ground. These are all variables set within the code that become available to us back in Unity. And then it's just performing on start and on update, which is so it looks at it every frame. This is basically where it looks when we press a button, perform an action. But so we'll edit the code within Visual Studio. We're not going to do any right now, but that's where that happens. So if we go back to our player character, we have the player controller script attached to it now. And what we need to do now is set up a trigger that checks whether our player is on the ground. So to get started with there, I'm going to go ahead and right click on the player character. I'm going to create an empty. I'm going to call it ground check. I'm going to select the ground check, and then over in the inspector I'm going to add a component. I'm going to go to Physics 2D, and I'm going to add a circle collider. And you can see it appears right here. I'm going to head and boost up the size, and then I'm going to drag it down to be at my player's feet, because this is going to intersect with the ground collider and then tell us whether is the player grounded or not. So last thing we do after we size it is we have to set it to be a trigger. So that's right here, trigger. Because if we left it as is, it would act as a collider and then just interfere with our other collider. So set as a trigger, and we should be good to go. So let's go back to our player character, and if we look down at the player controller script, you'll see ground check, a little ground check section here. It currently says none. We're just going to click on our ground check and drag it in there. So now it knows what trigger it should be looking at. So next thing we have to do is we have to tell it, okay, so what is considered ground? So to do that, we need to set up a layer. Now a layer is different from a sorting layer. So if I select my player, as usual, we see down here we have sorting layers. But if we look up at the top, we have layers. So layers are kind of just another way to tag and organize things and call specific things out. So I'm going to click default, and I'm going to add a layer. And I'll just use layer 6 here, and I'll add playable area. So now we have a new layer called playable areas. So now I need to apply something to the playable area. So if I go to my playable area, so like my ground layer here, this guy, we'll look up here and we'll see the layer, and I want to add it to the playable area layer. And then back on my player character, what is ground? Playable area. So these are our different layers, and we'll see here's our newly created playable area. So now anything with the tag playable area or with the layer setting playable area will be considered ground and will trigger our ground check. So to check if this is working, we need to, let's see, we have our playable area. We should be able to press play and it should fall down, and then we see grounded is checked because our player is intersecting with the ground. And if we lift them up, you'll see that grounded trigger in the bottom right turns off, and we let them go and they land, they turn on again. So once that system's set up, and that's the easy way to test if it's working, just watch the checkbox going on and off. We can now give ourselves some movement speed. I'm just going to set it to 10, give ourselves some jump height. Now, when we press play, we can use A and D on the keyboard to move back and forth, and then press W to hopefully jump. Now, in our current setup we have here, the jump has been a little funky, a little angry. So if it doesn't work, don't worry, but you should be at least able to move back and forth. Let me see if it will. So we're grounded, which is correct, and there we go. So now I press W and it jumps sometimes. But once you're moving, that's good. So next thing we want to do, after we have our movement set up, is we just want to simply make the camera follow us as we're moving. So that's easy to set up. We're going to select our main camera in the hierarchy. We're going to come over to the components. We're going to go to our scripts folder, select our main camera, and we're going to grab the follow camera and drag it in to the camera. And now it gives us some settings to play with. So if I set these, I'll just set these to 10, 10, and 100. Now we need to give it a target, so we're basically just telling it what to follow. I want it to follow the player character. And when we press play, our camera follows our player. And there you go. So last couple things to note before we'll call it for this first kind of grouping. Most importantly, when we're in play mode, so after you press the play button up here, you can still make changes. You can add objects to your scene. You can change values, which is useful for testing things out. But none of those changes will save. So when you leave play mode, anything you do while in play mode will go away. So always make sure when you press play to test something out, you immediately press it again to end it. Otherwise, you might have to redo something, and that's no fun. And then one last thing to go over quick is prefabs. So let's say I got this set up. I want to continue. I want to like duplicate this down. I want to go further in both directions. So you could drag in another ground, set up another collider on it, or you can select something in your scene or in your hierarchy, and if you drag it into your project window, it'll create a prefab, which is kind of like a blueprint from Unreal. So now with this playable area prefab, I can just drag this in, and you can see it already has my collision set up on it. So that's an easy way to kind of make a setup to repeat along the line. So that's prefabs. This is the point we're aiming to get to for this first day. To go over it again quickly, we want to have our assets imported, our texture sheets. We want them split up with the split function, which will break them apart. We want our character sheet also broken apart. Once they're broken apart, we have them brought, we drag them in, we rename them to stay organized, and once they're renamed, we go ahead and create sorting layers to organize them further and make sure they're displaying in the proper order. So we have sorting layers, then we go ahead and create our character, bring in the temporary character, we add a rigid body, we add a capsule collider, we add a collider to our ground, we set up the player controller to give ourselves some move speed, we create the ground check by adding a trigger volume to the player character, and once all that's set up, we have movement on our player, then we can add to the camera a follow camera script, and then we're good. So get your game to this point and you'll be ready for the next steps. The next steps, we're going to be looking into setting up animations so that when we move left and right, we cycle through our run animation. And then likewise, when we jump, we do our little jump animation. So to be ready for that, make sure you have some character animations set up.